Sitting proudly among many of its descendants sits one of the oldest engines in the Great Hall. It followed on the footsteps of Rocket, yet the two look a world apart. When you look at it, its shrapnel-ridden boiler and tender make the engine look like it had been in a terrible accident and that it is in need of repair. It is known as the Barrow and Furness engine Class A2 No. 3, but many call it Old Coppernob. The story of the engine started in Liverpool. Edward Berry was a local lad who had started up as a steam engineer and partner in a local sawmill. Wood and lumber didn't really excite Edward, but steam engines did. In 1826, he moved to set up his own iron foundry near the Manchester and Liverpool Railway, in the hope that he would be in prime position to supply the locomotives for the new line. But George Stephenson was not keen in letting other companies on his territory and objected to Edward's plans. Edward knew he was not going to win against the Liverpool and Manchester Railway's giant, so he moved to a new premises near the canal and dockyard. But he did get even with George with the appointment of James Kennedy. James had worked with George building locomotives, but had since gone rogue. The first engine the two men designed was destined to be a further thorn in George's side, inspired by a competition George himself created. Edward Berry and Company wanted to show the world and the railway what they were capable of, but time was not on the company's side, and Dreadnought was not ready in time for the most famous railway competition in modern history, the Rainhill Trials. The setback, though, was not going to deter the company, and they set to work on their second design. The engine, named Liverpool, was trialled on the Liverpool and Manchester line, but George was disgusted with the engine. He called the 4 6-foot wheels dangerous, so to appease the directors they were reduced. But the railway, under George's influence, would not settle on a design, so the engine was sold to another railway shortly afterwards. In fact, only one engine ended up gracing the metal of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, but all of Edward's other designs were shelved. Knowing that getting their engines on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was a pipe dream, the company, which was getting rather well known at this point, headed down south towards Birmingham and London. The new long and fast railway was finishing, and locomotive power was needed to run this new line. Edward put his proposal forward, and against all odds, he won. Edward proposed he would design the new locomotives on this new line, and his company would provide the maintenance and care, but in return, he would be paid per mile for every passenger and goods that ran on it. It didn't quite work out, and in time, he had to be paid the standard way. Even though he was unconventional in his approach, he did get the job done, and over half of the locomotives that ran on the line were his design. It was just enough of a foot in the door for other railways to notice him and ask him to provide locomotion on their railways too. In 1842, things were growing, and the partnership was too. The company had a new name of Berry, Curtis and Kennedy after the appointment of fellow manager Timothy. The engines that they created were some of the most unique engines ever seen. There was one common problem with early steam engines around this time, but no one had yet to discover the solution. That is, the engine's weight. The engines were made almost purely out of cast metal and wrought materials, and the weight was centered on a small amount of track, which would cause the track to warp and buckle. One option was to spread the weight, but it was quickly realized this was not the answer, as many engines tended to lift their wheels on curves. Berry decided to tackle the problem head-on. He used only 2 axles, but instead of a wrought iron rigid frame, he used a bar frame within the axles. The bar frame was strong enough to hold the axles and engine, but it was light enough not to have an impact on the rails. The other and more noticeable trait was settled within the firebox itself. Unlike many other fireboxes, the fireboxes on Bury engines were massive compared to those that ran on the main line. The larger capacity allowed for the gases to flow freely into the boiler. Nowadays, the brick arch generally does the work of this monstrous dome and helps funnel the gases around the firebox evenly. Bury set to work on a new class of engine after being commissioned by the Furness Railway. Using all he had, he was able to propose 4 new A2 locomotives especially for their line. By 1846, all 4 had been delivered and were painted in the burnished red. Its firebox was coated in brass and shone as bright as the sun when it was polished. The unusual shape earned the 4 engines the affectionate name of the Coppernobs. The A2 class would be one of the last engines Bury would build from his Liverpool works. Overseas investments had left the company heavily out of pocket, and a debt from the Russian government for a large-scale bridge was not repaid. Faced with no alternative solution, the works closed its doors, leaving 1,600 workers out of a job in 1851. The Coppernobs, though, worked throughout with little fuss. In 1860s, old number 1 and 2 had been scrapped, and 3 and 4 were looking good for the torch. But the number 3 engine was popular around the dockyards, having shunted trucks there for most of its life. And in 1900, after 55 years of devoted service, the people of Barrow in Furness decided to honour the old boy by retiring him. He was taken off the tracks and placed in a specially constructed glass case, so all could see the engine as they hustled and bustled around the main station. In the 40 years that the Coppernob spent in that case, it would see hundreds of thousands or even millions of people peer in. It was moved briefly to attend the Empire Exhibition in Wembley in 1924 and then went to Birmingham in 1938 before being returned to its glass case. War, though, had come to Barrow. The Blitz was nearing, and the station, knowing that they would be a prime target, made plans to move its prized engine to Clapham for storage. But just weeks before the move, the Blitz struck and a bomb hit the station. The blast shattered Coppernob's glass shell and shrapnel peppered its boiler and tender. The station staff moved the engine as soon as they could, but the damage was done. Rather than repair the damage, it was decided to leave the engine as it was, as a reminder of the devastation the station and town saw. The engine, already earmarked for preservation, was moved to the Clapham Transport Museum, where it was put on display, and later in the 1960s it found its home in the National Collection. It returned to Barrow for the Furness Railway's 150th anniversary, but its arrival was less than graceful. The engine missed its policed escort, ended up having its chimney removed due to not being able to fit under bridges, got stuck behind a broken down cement mixer, and finally caused chaos in Barrow when the driver was forced to drive the engine the wrong way down a one-way street, was caught on camera and turned up at the station with several police cars behind it having given chase. It returned a month later, with the driver still reeling after receiving a few choice words from the traffic officer. Sadly, though, the shrapnel was not the only thing to cause damage to this grand old troublemaker. In 2007, while on display in the National Railway Museum, the staff were devastated to discover that the engine's brass nameplate had been stolen when doing a routine clean. Brass nameplates, when bought through credible sources, can be extremely valuable, but due to the way this plate was taken, it is practically worthless as it can never be displayed. Sadly, like many things brass, the only value in the nameplate would have been its scrap, and so it is likely that the plate was melted down, sold, and lost to time. Not backed by the theft, but undeterred, the Coppernob was not ready to retire just yet. In 2014, the Railway Museum made plans to send the engine to Germany, where it was placed on display at the Leipzig-Dresden Railway. Even though not one of the A2 class had ever set foot off British soil, the similarities between it and the engines that ran on that railway were remarkable. It came back from its holiday and is now enjoying a well-earned retirement. Today the engine spends the majority of its time either in the Great Hall or at Shilston at the Railway Museum's sister site. The engine still bears the scars from the Blitz and are clearly visible, but the standout features is the gleaming brass against the stunning fiery red coat. The engine is a one-of-a-kind stunner, and even though the engine is knocking on for nearly 200 years old, there's still life and a great story in the Old Coppernob yet.